Ladies and gentlemen, brace yourselves, because something extraordinary, something absolutely crazy, has just shaken the foundations of global politics. And if you think this is just another headline in an endless news cycle, let me tell you, it's not. What we are witnessing today is not a small ripple, but a seismic tremor, one that will reshape economies, alter alliances, and expose the deep cracks that have long existed beneath the surface of our political and economic systems. Now, let me ask you, why does it feel as though every new shock, whether it comes from trade wars, sudden conflicts, banking collapses, or mass social unrest, keeps catching the so-called experts by surprise? Why do the people in power always act shocked, as though history itself has not been warning us for decades? The truth is, these shocks are not random. They are the logical consequences of an economic system that concentrates wealth at the top while leaving the majority scrambling for security. The crazy we see in politics is not madness. It is the inevitable outcome of capitalism's contradictions playing themselves out on the global stage. Consider this: when workers are squeezed, when public services are slashed, when housing becomes unaffordable, and when young generations inherit debt instead of opportunity, what do you think happens? People rebel, nations fracture, alliances weaken, leaders turn to nationalism, protectionism, and authoritarianism as desperate strategies to hold on to power. And yet, in the mainstream narrative, we're told to see each crisis in isolation, as if they are disconnected events. No, they are all connected threads in the same unraveling fabric. And here's the hook you cannot ignore: what's shaking global politics today is not just the movement of governments or leaders. It is the movement of people, ordinary people. From striking workers in Europe to protesting farmers in Asia, from debt-burdened students in the US to voters in countries tired of false promises, the common thread is discontent. The system is failing them, and they know it. That is what's truly crazy, not the chaos itself, but the fact that those in charge thought they could postpone the reckoning forever. So, where does this leave us? It leaves us at a crossroads. Either we allow the same old policies, endless austerity, endless wars, endless inequality, to continue pushing us toward instability, or we begin the hard, necessary work of reimagining our economy. That means democratizing the workplace, redistributing wealth, and redefining what progress looks like, not in terms of GDP or stock market numbers, but in terms of how secure, educated, and healthy our citizens are. Let me close with this: history is knocking at our door. The crazy shake-up we are living through is not the end. It is the beginning of something new. The question is whether we will seize this moment to build a fairer, more sustainable system, or whether we will watch as the same patterns repeat until the next crazy crisis arrives. The choice, my friends, is not theirs, it is ours. Something has rattled the global stage in a way that feels different, heavier, more consequential than the usual turbulence of international politics. When we speak of shockwaves, we are not describing just a single event, a sudden election result, a surprising coup, or an economic downturn. We are talking about a chain reaction that moves across borders, unsettling governments, financial markets, and entire populations. The kind of shake-up we are seeing today does not remain confined to one region. It spreads, amplifies, and destabilizes because the systems that bind nations together, trade, finance, migration, technology, security, are so deeply interconnected that a disturbance in one part of the world is instantly felt everywhere else. It is as if the globe itself has become one tightly wound system where the smallest fracture can send tremors through the entire structure. Let me ask you, why does it feel as if every time the world begins to stabilize, something arrives that throws the entire balance off again? Whether it's a war that disrupts energy supplies, a banking crisis that ripples through stock markets, or an election that upends alliances, the so-called normal has become constant instability. This is not coincidence. It is the byproduct of decades of policies that prioritize profit over people, short-term gain over long-term stability, and narrow national interest over collective security. The result: a global order that is perpetually vulnerable to shocks, where each new crisis is not an anomaly, but a feature of the system itself. The crazy moment we're witnessing now is simply the latest tremor in a fault line that has been widening for decades. The hooks in this story are undeniable. Think about it: when a sudden event in one country can raise food prices in another thousands of miles away, when an election in one nation can weaken currencies halfway across the globe, when the struggles of workers in a single sector can ignite protests that spill into streets across continents, what does that tell us? It tells us that the world has become more fragile than our leaders care to admit. It tells us that despite all the talk of progress, globalization, and stability, the political and economic structures holding this world together are alarmingly brittle. And yet, those in power continue to act surprised, as though this global interconnectedness is news to them. The global shockwaves we see today are not just about governments being tested. They are about people, ordinary people, whose lives are being upended by forces far outside their control. A farmer in India facing rising fertilizer prices because of a geopolitical standoff in Europe, a factory worker in Germany suddenly out of a job because supply chains were disrupted in Asia, a family in the United States struggling with higher costs of food and housing because global energy markets have been destabilized. These are not isolated struggles. They are linked, connected by the web of global politics and economics that ties all of us together. That is why the shock feels so profound, because it is personal. It reaches into homes, onto dinner tables, into workplaces. It is not abstract, not distant. It is lived reality. And here's the question you must grapple with: if the global system is this vulnerable to disruption, what does that say about the future? Can a world order that trembles with every shock truly sustain itself? Can a system that magnifies crises rather than containing them ever offer real security? These are not academic questions, they are urgent ones. Each new global shake-up is not only a test of governments, but a test of whether the system itself can adapt, or whether it is destined to stumble from one crazy moment to the next. That is why what we are seeing now matters so deeply. It is not just another news cycle. It is history reminding us that when you build a house on a shaky foundation, the tremors will always come. If we want to understand why the world seems to be in a constant state of turmoil, we must look beyond the headlines and focus on the engine that drives these crises: the economy. At the heart of today's global instability are contradictions so deep, so persistent, that they cannot be explained away as temporary mismanagement or simple political mistakes. They are built into the very structure of capitalism itself. It is this system that concentrates wealth in the hands of a few while leaving the vast majority fighting for stability. It is this system that rewards speculation over production, profit over people, and short-term financial gain over the long-term health of societies. And when you build an economic order on contradictions of this magnitude, shock and instability become the rule, not the exception. Let me ask you directly: how can we call an economy successful when the wealthiest 1% owns more than the bottom half of the world combined? How can we celebrate growth when it comes at the cost of stagnant wages, rising debt, and crumbling public services? These contradictions do not remain hidden. They show up in the anger of workers demanding fair wages, in the despair of young people buried under student loans, in the outrage of families priced out of housing, and in the cynicism of citizens who no longer believe their governments work for them. The very success of capitalism in enriching a minority has generated the conditions for widespread discontent, political upheaval, and social unrest. That is not a coincidence. It is cause and effect. The hooks here are clear and undeniable. When financial markets surge while millions live paycheck to paycheck, people begin to ask hard questions. When billionaires see their fortunes grow during global crisis while ordinary workers lose jobs and homes, frustration turns into resistance. When promises of opportunity collide with the reality of inequality, citizens stop believing in the system altogether. This is why global politics today looks chaotic. The economic contradictions have finally caught up with the political order that has been built to protect them. Governments can paper over these cracks for a while with slogans, subsidies, or emergency measures, but the underlying tension remains. waiting for the next crisis to bring it roaring back to the surface. Think of it like a pressure cooker. For decades, policies have allowed corporations to maximize profits by cutting wages, moving jobs overseas, and weakening unions. At the same time, governments have reduced social spending, privatized public goods, and shifted burdens onto ordinary citizens. People absorbed these blows as long as they believed the system would eventually reward their patience. But the promised rewards never came. Instead, inequality widened, insecurity deepened, and the pressure built. And now, each new shock, whether a financial crash, a global pandemic, or a trade war, acts like heat under that cooker, bringing the contradictions closer to an explosion. And here is where the political consequences become clear. As these contradictions intensify, leaders around the world find themselves caught in a bind. They must defend the system that keeps them in power, but they also must respond to the anger of the people suffering under it. Some double down on authoritarianism, using force and nationalism to suppress dissent. Others try to appease with limited reforms that never touch the roots of the problem. But none of these responses resolve the contradictions themselves. They only delay the reckoning, ensuring that the next crisis will hit harder and with greater consequences. So when you hear that global politics has been shaken by something crazy, understand that it is not crazy at all. It is entirely predictable. It is the natural outcome of a system that demands endless growth in a finite world, that celebrates wealth while creating poverty, that insists it is stable while producing instability. These contradictions are not just economic, they are political, social, and cultural. They erode trust, weaken institutions, and fuel the very turbulence we are now forced to confront. The real madness is not the chaos we see today. The real madness is believing such a system could hold forever without breaking. Across the world today, the voices of ordinary people are rising louder than ever before, and they are not simply whispers of frustration, they are demands for change. Public discontent is no longer a background noise in politics. It has become the defining force shaking governments, institutions, and global order itself. When you see workers walking out of factories in Europe, farmers blocking highways in Asia, or students filling public squares in the United States, you are not seeing isolated protests. You are seeing the living expression of a deeper truth. Millions of people recognize that the systems meant to serve them have failed, and they are no longer willing to remain silent. But here's the question that should unsettle every leader watching these events unfold. How long can governments contain this wave of dissatisfaction before it overwhelms the structures of authority? For decades, politicians, economists, and corporate elites insisted that progress was inevitable, that globalization and free markets would deliver prosperity for all. Instead, people have seen wages stagnate, costs of living soar, opportunities shrink, and inequality explode. What we are witnessing now is the backlash to those broken promises, and it is shaking the very legitimacy of political and economic systems across the globe. The hooks in this story practically leap out at us. Imagine this: a delivery driver working 10-hour days for barely enough to cover rent watches news of billionaires flying private jets to climate conferences. A farmer struggling to feed his family because imported goods undercut local markets, sees corporations receiving subsidies while he is told to be competitive. A graduate carrying a mountain of student debt looks around and realizes the promised opportunities have been outsourced, automated, or concentrated in the hands of the privileged few. These are not just personal struggles. They are sparks of anger that ignite into mass movements when millions share the same story. That shared discontent is what transforms private frustration into public action, into marches, strikes, and uprisings that political elites cannot ignore. Consider how quickly small acts of protest now spread across borders. A demonstration in one city is live-streamed, tweeted, and broadcast instantly to others, turning local discontent into global solidarity. Workers in one country see their counterparts in another demanding higher wages, and suddenly a strike becomes part of a larger wave. Farmers fighting for fair prices in one region inspire similar movements elsewhere. Students calling for debt relief in one nation echo the cries of those in another. Technology has connected these voices, magnifying their impact and creating a chorus of discontent that no wall, no border, no censorship can completely silence. What unnerves the powerful is not just the volume of these protests, but the persistence behind them. In the past, leaders could rely on fatigue or repression to wear down movements. Today, however, discontent is not fading, it is growing. Why? Because the material conditions fueling it have not been resolved. The rising cost of living, insecure work, crumbling public services, and widening inequality are not temporary problems, they are permanent features of the current economic model. Each attempt to silence or distract only fuels more anger, more distrust, more determination among those who feel betrayed, and so the political consequences become inescapable. As public discontent grows, traditional parties lose credibility, populist movements gain traction, and the very foundations of democracy come under pressure. Citizens who no longer believe the system serves them become open to alternatives, whether progressive or reactionary. The danger for the elites is clear. If people cannot find justice within the current system, they will seek it outside of it. This is why public discontent is not merely a problem of unrest, it is a force capable of reshaping politics entirely. The street-level frustrations of workers, farmers, and students are not just noise, they are the earthquake beneath the surface, and sooner or later, they will reshape the landscape above. For generations, global alliances were presented as the pillars of stability, the bedrock upon which international order rested. We were told that treaties, trade pacts, and military coalitions would guarantee peace, prosperity, and security. Yet today, those very alliances are showing signs of fracture, and the cracks are widening faster than most leaders are willing to admit. The partnerships that once seemed unshakable are now strained by competing national interests, rising economic pressures, and the weight of domestic discontent. What we are witnessing is not just a shift in diplomacy, it is a reconfiguration of the entire geopolitical map, and the tremors from these fractures are reverberating across the world. Ask yourself this: how long can alliances hold when the conditions that created them no longer exist? The Cold War gave us NATO, trade liberalization gave us institutions like the WTO, and post-war reconstruction gave us regional unions. But the world of today is not the world of yesterday. Nations are no longer bound by the same fears, the same priorities, or the same economic realities. In fact, what once united them has become a source of division. Shared security concerns have turned into disagreements over strategy. Shared economic goals have collapsed under the weight of inequality, and shared values have been exposed as fragile, sometimes even hollow. This is why alliances are fracturing, not because of a single disagreement, but because the foundation itself is eroding. The hooks in this moment are striking. Consider NATO allies publicly questioning each other's commitments, with debates over defense spending turning into public disputes. Look at trade blocs once hailed as engines of growth, now consumed by internal disputes over tariffs, subsidies, and national sovereignty. Witness long-standing partnerships tested by global crises such as energy shortages, pandemics, or climate change, where countries that promise cooperation instead retreat into self-preservation. Every fracture reveals the same truth: when push comes to shove, nations will prioritize their own survival over any collective commitment, and that reality is straining the alliances built on idealistic promises of unity. This fracturing has enormous consequences. When alliances weaken, deterrence falters. When trade agreements break down, markets lose confidence. When partnerships unravel, smaller nations find themselves caught between competing powers, forced to choose sides or risk isolation. For ordinary people, the effects are just as immediate: higher costs of goods when trade wars erupt, reduced security when military cooperation falters, and less trust in leaders who once spoke of solidarity but now act in isolation. The instability we see on the global stage is not abstract, it flows directly into homes, jobs, and communities. And here lies the danger that leaders rarely admit: fractured alliances create power vacuums. When once powerful blocs weaken, ambitious rivals step in to reshape the rules. We see it in the rise of new economic partnerships outside traditional Western dominance, in the shifting allegiances of nations aligning with emerging powers, and in the growing skepticism of global institutions once thought untouchable. These changes are not signs of healthy adaptation, they are symptoms of a system unraveling, a system that cannot reconcile the contradictions between lofty promises of cooperation and the hard reality of national competition. But perhaps the most telling hook is the loss of trust, not just between nations, but between leaders and their own citizens. People were promised that alliances would deliver prosperity, that trade deals would lift all boats, that military partnerships would guarantee safety. Instead, they see wars dragging on, costs of living rising, and benefits flowing disproportionately to elites and corporations. As public discontent grows, governments find it harder to justify international commitments, and alliances weaken further. It is a vicious cycle, one that accelerates the very fracturing it tries to contain. The truth is stark: global alliances are not collapsing because of a single event or a single leader. They are fracturing because they were built on a system that has failed to adapt to new realities. Nationalism is rising, protectionism is spreading, and trust is eroding. What once seemed solid now feels fragile, and the global order is left wobbling on a foundation that can no longer support its weight. The world is entering a phase where the old rules no longer apply, and the alliances that once defined politics may soon be relics of a bygone era. Time and again, the world has been warned. Economists, historians, activists, and even whistleblowers have sounded alarms about the dangers ahead, yet those in positions of power consistently treat every crisis as though it were a bolt of lightning out of a clear sky. This pattern of ignoring warnings is not only reckless, it is one of the defining reasons why global politics feels so unstable today. When leaders choose short-term convenience over long-term responsibility, when they silence critics instead of heeding their insights, the inevitable result is a world perpetually caught off guard by shocks that were visible long before they struck. Consider the global financial crash of 2008. For years, voices warned about the ballooning housing bubble, predatory lending practices, and the over-leveraging of banks. But those warnings were dismissed as pessimism, as obstacles to growth. When the collapse came, politicians scrambled to act surprised, as if no one could have seen it coming. The same can be said of the climate crisis, where decades of scientific research offered clear evidence of rising risks. Instead of transforming energy systems and consumption habits, governments chose delay, half measures, or outright denial. And today, as floods, fires, and storms disrupt entire regions, leaders again stand at podiums expressing shock, when the truth is, they ignored the warnings that brought us here. Here is the hook that should capture your attention. Every major political or economic disaster of our time was preceded by warnings that went unheard. The refugee crisis born from endless wars, the collapse of trust in democratic institutions, the anger of workers left behind by globalization, all of these were predictable. None of them came out of nowhere. What makes them shocking is not their arrival, but the stubborn refusal of those in charge to prepare for them. Ignoring warnings has become a habit, a strategy even, because to acknowledge them would mean confronting the uncomfortable truth that the system itself is unsustainable. The cost of ignoring warnings is not measured only in political instability, it is measured in human lives. Workers who lost jobs and homes in the financial crisis were not just numbers on a spreadsheet. Communities devastated by climate-related disasters are not abstract case studies. Families fleeing conflict zones after years of ignored geopolitical tensions are not just statistics. Each crisis carries a human cost, one that might have been mitigated, even prevented, had warnings been taken seriously. The true tragedy is not that we face crises, but that so many of them could have been anticipated and avoided. And yet the cycle repeats. Governments and institutions treat crises as isolated, one-off events, never daring to connect the dots. They respond with bandages, bailouts, emergency relief, temporary subsidies, while the deeper causes remain untouched. Why? Because to truly address the warnings would require systemic change, and systemic change threatens the interests of those who benefit from the status quo. So leaders act shocked, offer quick fixes, and wait for the news cycle to move on. Meanwhile, the next warning builds quietly, ignored once again until it explodes into the next, unexpected, crisis. What makes this so dangerous is the erosion of trust that follows. When ordinary people see that warnings were ignored, that experts were silenced, that problems were allowed to fester, they lose confidence not only in governments, but in the very institutions meant to protect them. Citizens begin to suspect that crises are not accidents at all, but outcomes of deliberate negligence or corruption. This suspicion fuels discontent, fractures alliances, and destabilizes political systems. In the end, ignored warnings become more than mistakes, they become accelerants of instability. So the world finds itself in a paradox. The signs of future crises are already here, visible for anyone willing to look. Rising inequality, ecological collapse, fragile financial systems, growing disillusionment with democracy. These are warnings in plain sight, and yet history suggests that once again, those in power will avert their eyes, dismiss the concerns, and carry on as if the future will somehow fix itself. That is the madness of our time, not that crises happen, but that the world keeps pretending they were impossible to foresee. The world today stands at a decisive crossroads, a point in history where the choices made will determine not just the direction of individual nations, but the very trajectory of humanity itself. Every crisis we face, economic instability, environmental collapse, political disillusionment, social unrest, is converging into a single question. Will we continue down the path of repeating the same failed strategies, or will we summon the courage to imagine and build something new? This is not a theoretical debate for the future, it is a pressing reality unfolding before our eyes. The crossroads is here now, demanding a decision. The hook that should seize your attention is this: the system as it stands has already revealed its limits. The endless pursuit of growth has collided with ecological boundaries. The concentration of wealth has produced political paralysis. The reliance on military power has deepened global insecurity rather than resolved it. And yet, the institutions tasked with guiding society insist on doubling down, as though doing more of what already fails will magically produce success. Standing at this crossroads, the insanity is not in acknowledging the need for change. It is in pretending we can continue as if nothing is wrong. But what does change mean in practice? It begins with reimagining the economy, not as a machine for enriching a minority, but as a system designed to meet human needs. That means questioning who controls production, how wealth is distributed, and what values guide investment. It requires democratizing the workplace, ensuring workers have a real voice in decisions that affect their lives. It demands moving beyond the narrow obsession with GDP and stock markets, and instead measuring progress by the well-being of people and the health of the planet. At this crossroads, the choice is stark. Do we cling to numbers that mask inequality, or do we embrace a vision of prosperity rooted in fairness and sustainability? The political dimension of this moment is just as urgent. Across the globe, trust in traditional institutions is collapsing, and citizens are searching for alternatives. Some are drawn to reactionary movements that promise quick fixes through nationalism, exclusion, or authoritarian control. Others are drawn toward progressive visions of equality, solidarity, and systemic reform. Which path societies choose will shape the character of global politics for generations to come. The crossroads is not simply between more or less growth, more or less globalization. It is between democracy that deepens and democracy that decays, between cooperation that heals and competition that destroys. And let us not forget the human element that makes this moment so powerful. Millions of people, from young activists marching for climate justice to workers striking for fair wages, already understand that this crossroads cannot be ignored. They know the cost of inaction because they live it daily: rising rents, insecure jobs, crushing debt, environmental destruction. They know that waiting for the next crisis to force change will only deepen the suffering. Their actions are the signposts pointing toward a different path, one where the energy of public discontent is channeled into building new institutions rather than tearing down old ones. The most sobering hook in all of this is that time is not on our side. Crossroads are not permanent. They demand decisions, and decisions delayed often become decisions made by default. If humanity chooses to stay the current course, instability will worsen, inequality will deepen, and ecological collapse will accelerate. But if we seize the opportunity to rethink, restructure, and rebuild, we can begin to turn crises into openings for renewal. The crossroads is therefore not just a test of governments, it is a test of collective imagination, of whether we can look beyond fear and inertia to create a system that truly serves the many instead of the few. The choice is here. The question is whether we are ready to make it,